my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Great, yeah, thank you for joining us this evening. Just to introduce myself, I'm Simon Cox. I've been a maths teacher for 17 years now at various different schools, always in Blackpool, and currently director of the Blackpool Research School, where I work for 2 days a week, and I'm seconded at the moment directly to EEF, working as their maths content specialist for the other 3 days a week. So that's me. I say I'm really glad to be able to join you here this evening. A little bit first about what we do at EEF and the Research School Network and why we do it. So EEF are primarily known as grant funders and putting together research trials and teaching and learning toolkits and things like that. But actually, a lot of people don't realise that the fundamental mission of the EEF is to look at breaking the link between family income and educational achievement. So EEF were formed in 2011, which is about the same time as the Pupil Premium came into being. And in fact, the Teaching and Learning Toolkit was originally called the Pupil Premium Toolkit because it was aimed to help school leaders make decisions about what to spend their pupil premium funding on, according to what the evidence suggests might work. And we don't say will work, we never say that, because we're talking here about best bets and things that have worked somewhere, but there's no guarantees, obviously, that it's going to work in other contexts. And the reason we do that is because we have this situation where a majority of 19-year-olds who have been eligible for free school meals in this country leave school without a good qualification in English and maths, by which we mean grade 4 or grade C in old money. And the majority of 19-year-olds who haven't been eligible for free school meals do have those good qualifications. So we've got a significant gap there between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged. And if you read the latest report from the Education Policy Institute, their annual review, it isn't getting any better, unfortunately. And some of the research that we did over the summer at EEF, and it was led by Professor Rob Coe, suggests that actually the partial school closures may have undone any of the good work that's been done over the last 10 years to start to narrow that disadvantage gap. So we know there's an issue, and that is why we do what we do. And how we do that? Well, there's three main arms of our work. The first one is synthesis. So I've already mentioned the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, and this is where we draw together existing research evidence, not always UK-based evidence, it could be international evidence, and we put that into a format that's a bit more useful for teachers, because, you know, I'm a teacher, I get how busy people are, and with the best will in the world, we haven't got time to trawl through hundreds of research papers to find things that might work in our settings. So that's kind of what the Teaching and Learning Toolkit does. It brings together all of those things in a synthesis of existing evidence. Lesser known is the Early Years Toolkit. And you know, if you do work with early years practitioners, it's well worth pointing that in their direction, because that is much less well known and much less used in the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. But there's also evidence reviews as well, and actually the evidence review that underpinned the Key Stage 2 and 3 guidance report is on the EEF website, and it's a really interesting read. It's about 200 pages long, so it's certainly not as succinct as the guidance report, but it's what that does is it will tell you perhaps some of the reasons why some things didn't make it to the report. So it has things in there and has their evidence strength. So you might think, why was that not in? Why was there nothing in there about textbooks, for example? And you can look up textbooks in the evidence review and you'll see what it said about textbooks and perhaps why that didn't make it into the final cut. Then the next arm is generation. And this is where we commission research trials. A couple of reasons. It could be to plug a gap in the evidence base. So, you know, we've noticed that no one's really done any particular trials into maths tutoring, for example. So EEF will commission a trial into maths tutoring. And these are usually randomized control trials, pretty much always, which means that we have, let's say we've got 100 schools, 50 do an intervention, 50 don't, and then at the end, the results are compared, and we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty, based upon the evidence that we've got, that the thing that we did was the thing that made the difference, or not, as the case might be. And actually, that's an important point to make, because the evidence we generate doesn't just tell us what works, it tells us what doesn't work, and that's just as important from EEF's point of view, because as with anything in schools, if we're going to do things we need to stop doing other things because we need to create some space in order to, teachers and school leaders are really, really busy people. So we need to make sure that we aren't wasting our time maybe on some things which are less effective. And also sometimes there's the decision to make there about, we might have to stop doing something that actually is working fairly well to do something that would work even better. And again, those are some tough decisions that leaders have to make. And then there's mobilisation, and part of my job at the research school in Blackpool is to mobilise the evidence, so to share the evidence, things like this and other events, but also training courses that we put on about a variety of different things, not just maths, and also the guidance reports. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about one of the guidance reports this evening. That's a way of mobilising the evidence. So relatively brief documents, usually 30 or 40 pages, which have a series of recommendations for schools, and we call them the best bets. If you want to improve maths in Key Stages 2 and 3, here are your best bets for starting to do that. And I've just picked a few things here that are relevant to maths. So you can see from the toolkit at the top there, we've got mastery learning is one of the strands of the toolkit. We have to be careful with mastery learning because it isn't necessarily a particular brand of mastery learning. In this case, it was, but it's the concept of mastery learning. Then generation, we've got trials on maths mastery there and shared maths, and one there that's one of our promising projects. And what they are is out of the 200 trials that EEF have commissioned, ones that show particular promise in an area. It could be that they have a particular good bang for the buck. You get a reasonable amount of evidence for something that's really cheap, or it could be that something just shows real promise in narrowing a gap in a particular area. We label that as a promising project, and there's about 20 of those. And 1 billion, the one that you can see on the screen there, is one. It's an app that's based that's aimed at early years in Key Stage 1, and it's really good. I've used it with my 3-year-old. He's my guinea pig for anything like that. But it's we did a trial into that, and it came out with some positive results. Another one is First Class at Number, which again is aimed at, it's an intervention led by teaching assistants for Key Stage 1 children. Interestingly, we haven't really found much in the way of interventions that narrows the gap at Key Stage 2 and 3. And I think that's important because it isn't that we haven't looked. And actually, what we're finding is that as children get older, interventions possibly become a little bit less effective. There are exceptions, but actually it points towards the fact that getting it right in the classroom is the best thing that we can do, because when that gap opens up, it's really hard to close it again. And once children fall behind, it's really hard to catch them up. And that might be, it's conjecture, but that might be why some of these early years and Key Stage 1 approaches are being labelled as promising and some of the later ones aren't, because it's easier to narrow the gap when the gap isn't quite so big. And then mobilisation, I've got a picture there of the Key Stage 2 and 3 guidance report, but we've got another one now as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. And what do we mean by evidence at EEF? Well, we are quite strict on what can make it into things like the guidance reports and the toolkit. It needs to have robust methods behind it and measurable outcomes. We tend to go for things that have large representative samples rather than small trials. In fact, some of our smaller trials are labelled as efficacy trials, and then when we scale them up, they're called effectiveness trials, because that's the bigger the better, really, in terms of research evidence and the sample size. If we've got them, meta-analyses and literature reviews tend to be better than single studies, and also our guidance reports are underpinned by all of those and an expert panel as well, who are really useful. We take an expert panel from academia, but also from research schools and other schools, so that we can really get an expert practitioner opinion on whether or not we are going in the right direction with our reports. And why we think it's important to use evidence? Well, one criticism is often that, you can't find evidence to support everything. There's things we do in schools that aren't underpinned by evidence, and absolutely that's the case. And we are not for a second suggesting that schools should have everything they do being evidence-based. That would not work. It wouldn't be sensible. But what we think it comes under this umbrella of evidence-informed practice is taking the evidence, being aware of the evidence, combining it with professional expertise. And I would also put context in there as well, because that's important. I was talking earlier on today to some colleagues about the real differences in addressing issues in London as compared to where I work in Blackpool. And just because something worked in London schools does not mean it's going to work in Blackpool schools. It might, but context matters. So taking all of those things together and forming this evidence-informed practice where we're aware of what's out there, as well as using our own expertise and judgment. And it helps us get beyond some of these really quite polarizing debates. I spend a little bit too much time on Twitter. And if anyone else on here spends a little bit too much time on Twitter, you'll know that Twitter can get very divisive sometimes, and there can be arguments, and they're usually quite polarized. And actually the research evidence helps us get beyond that. So getting beyond those headlines, getting beyond those single studies and things like that, to a broader sort of look at actually overall, the picture is that this is probably the best kind of way to go. And I will come back to this because I've mentioned it already, but I just think it's so important. This is just a little extract from our school planning guide, which came out over the summer holidays. It's on the EEF website. It's not specifically aimed at maths, but it's aimed at really at school leaders who are looking to think about the year ahead. And this quote, that the best available evidence indicates that great teaching is the most important lever schools have to improve outcomes. This was true before the pandemic and continues to be true now. And I think that's just such an important message as we navigate this difficult year, because there's all this talk of catch up and recovery, and these things are important, and some children will need to catch up, and we'll need to get back to some kind of normality. But actually, focusing on the classroom teaching is the best thing that we can do for our young people. Then thinking about the sort of wider strategies and targeted interventions where it's needed. One of the issues there is actually finding where it's needed. And as Pat said at the start, one of the questions that's been asked a lot in the sign up, and that's not unusual, I've been asked it a lot in the last month or two, is about assessment. How do we find out where the gaps are? How do we find out which of our pupils are likely to need that little bit of extra support, and so on? I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we move on. And I think one of the issues with maths teaching in general, but particularly at the moment where we've got this situation where we've had most children out of classrooms for anything up to 6 months, we can often children can often see maths as these separate concepts, and whereby they might be actually quite happy with how to plot a graph, or how to solve an equation, or how to find the area of a triangle, or whatever it happens to be. They don't necessarily make those links between those different topics. We as maths educators, we've sort of got this overview of maths, and it's this rich tapestry of all these things that we know interconnect. And children haven't necessarily got that. And I think one of the things that the research evidence really helps us with is finding ways to teach in which we can start to make these connections between these topics. And over time, we come up with this sort of shared view of maths, which the teacher and the children share, with all of these different interconnected ideas, which is obviously what we should be aiming for as classroom teachers. So I just want to mention the guidance report, which is, as Pat said at the start, it's 3 years old now, which in guidance report term is pretty old. There were only 2 around before the maths one, and now there's about 16 of them. So it's come a long way in the last few years. But the evidence still stands. The evidence review that we did back in 2017. Somebody asked on the sign-up notes if there was any plans to update that. Not yet is the answer. It doesn't mean it won't be done. It almost certainly will be done. And the Key Stage 1 literacy one has just been revisited, and it's very likely that it will be revisited, but that's not on the agenda just yet. So the process that we go through for this is we first of all scoped out what we were going to include in this report, and it's unique actually amongst EEF guidance reports in that it goes cross-phase, key stage 2 and 3, and all the literacy ones are based on a key stage, but this one is different. And the reason for that was because actually, when we looked at the evidence around maths teaching, the fundamental sort of principles, the best bets for maths teaching, were basically the same for Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. And I think we have to remember that this distinction between the key stages is completely arbitrary. We could have drawn the line somewhere else. And maths is a continuum, and it isn't, you know, pigeonholed into those arbitrary key stages. So it makes sense really that the evidence was similar across the two. It's a bit different for much younger children, but for those two, it was broadly similar. And one of the nice things that's come out of that is the opportunity for teachers to work together. And I think that's one of the big things that certainly leading training on the report in the years after it was published. Getting primary teachers and secondary teachers in the same room talking about maths together. Some of them had never done that. You know, we had primary teachers who had never talked to a secondary teacher about maths, and vice versa. And it was really beneficial. And when we had teachers going into each other's phases, which was logistically tricky sometimes, but every single one of them said how positive an experience it was visiting the other key stage and finding out what maths looks like. And every single person without exception learned something from that process. So I think that was a nice consequence of putting the two key stages within the one report. We had our evidence review, and I've already mentioned that. It's on the website. Have a look at it. It's great. Led by Jeremy Hodgson and Colin Foster, who are well known in maths education. There were some other people involved as well, but they were the two that led that review. We then wrote the report and the recommendations, and that was EEF that took hold of that then. So the evidence review was independent, but EEF wrote the recommendations based on the things that they had told us from the review. And then we put the evidence to work, so we share it. And we devised training and so on. And that was an 18-month process in total. So even, you know, if we do decide to update the report one day, when you hear it's being updated, don't expect it quickly because it just doesn't work like that. And that's right. It should be a rigorous and in-depth process that we're going through. And these were our recommendations, and I know you can't read that, but there were 8, which is quite a lot actually for an EEF guidance report. There's usually sort of between 5 and 7, and those recommendations, I think this overview poster is really useful, but I would urge people to drill deeper than this and read the report in full, because this is only supposed to be an overview. And I find this useful once people have fully engaged with the report, to then use this to go back to, but I wouldn't use this as a starting point. And there's also an audit tool linked to this. So if you go on the EEF website, you will find an audit tool, which is free to download, and you can use that to assess your school's practice against these different areas. One of the things that we've noticed, and I can completely understand why it happens, sometimes when people just read the headlines, they think, well, yeah, I'll do that. You know, some of them are like, the first one is dead vague. It just says like use assessment to build on pupils' existing knowledge and understanding. Yeah, do that. And actually, it's only when you start to drill down into what that really looks like that people think, actually, we sort of do that, but we could do this bit much better. And that's why the audit tool is so useful to start that conversation. It's not a perfect tool by any means, but we did it in our department, and we decided that manipulatives and problem solving were the two real focus areas for us, and has remained so for the last couple of years, because implementing something like that takes time. So just to remind you of what the recommendations were, and I'm just going to briefly talk around these before I start on answering some of the questions that were sent my way. So the first one about using assessment to build on knowledge and understanding, I'm going to park that one because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Manipulatives and representations. When Colin Foster did an interview, and I think it was with Craig Barton on his podcast, but I might be wrong. But anyway, he said that he was looking for something with the wealth of evidence behind it that phonics has, but for maths teaching. And he said he didn't find it, but manipulatives came closest. So using manipulatives is really important. It comes through the early years in Key Stage 1 report as well, that's come out this year. So right across the key stages, and actually the evidence goes beyond Key Stage 3. We should continue to use manipulatives for as long as children need to use manipulatives, and for as long as it's mathematically appropriate. How you use them is the critical thing. And so when you it's what I mean about going in depth into some of these recommendations, because on the surface you might think, oh yeah, we've got loads of manipulatives, great, tick, move on. Actually, how you link the manipulative to the mathematics being learned, how you decide which manipulative to use for different mathematical concepts is really important, as is the exit strategy. How are you going to stop using that manipulative? Because even though we shouldn't rush that, it is something that you're going to need to think about, and it could be towards representation. So that was probably the recommendation that got the most attention, actually, and continues to. Number 3 is about teaching strategies for solving problems. And there were a lot of questions about problem solving sent my way before this webinar. What we found with problem solving is that there's all sorts of schools of thought about problem solving, and to be honest, the evidence didn't really sort of solve some of those issues. But what it did point towards is the fact that we using heuristics for problem solving, so using things like checklists and really sharing strategies for solving problems with children was a really effective thing to do. And I think sometimes we lose a little bit of sight of what we mean by problem solving. And for me, and for the evidence review team, problem solving basically meant something for which you don't have a method. If you have a method that's going to work every time you have a question like that, that's not problem solving, because you've got a clearly defined method that you use every time. Rather, problem solving is those meaty problems that are unique almost, because you've never met anything quite like that before. It reminds me of the old Key Stage 3 SATs papers. They used to be brilliant at dreaming up all sorts of bizarre scenarios. There's some great questions on the old Key Stage 3 SATs papers, actually sharing with children, actually this is a good strategy to use when you are problem solving. So things like drawing a diagram and so on, but finding something that works for you and using that as a framework to teach those strategies to the young people. Also things like modeling. So myself and a colleague did this a few years ago. It was really great, actually. So we went into each other's classrooms with a problem that we chose individually to give to the teacher that they had never seen before, and in front of their class they then had a go at solving this problem. And it wasn't a dead easy problem. It was something that really made you stop and think, and the idea behind that was children don't often see that. They don't often see their teacher struggling with a piece of mathematics. They often see a teacher who has worked out all the answers in advance and is just really familiar with the types of problems that they're solving because that they've seen so many of them. And I think that it was really good for that. And what that got across to us is the importance of this sort of sharing what's in your head as a mathematician, because there's loads of decisions that we make when we're solving problems that almost become implicit, and actually practicing modeling that to a group of children is a really effective strategy to use, because they will see then actually, oh, so this isn't as clear cut, my teacher can't just do everything. This isn't a side, but I always get a little bit I always get a little bit not upset, that's the wrong word, but when people want absolute perfect work in books. By perfect I mean no crossings out and that kind of, and I don't know about you, but that's not how I do maths. And if I'm really thinking hard about maths, it'll be quite messy actually, until I come to write up my final solution, in which case it'll be far more structured. And actually, kids seeing that sort of spilling out of what's going on in your head as you're solving a problem. Enabling pupils to develop a rich network of mathematical knowledge. There were all sorts of different parts to this one. I'm not going to go into depth on this because this wasn't one that people tended to ask about. But so there were all sorts of bits in there. Misconceptions came up a lot, by the way, in the report. It wasn't a specific recommendation, but it kept coming up. And if you search for misconceptions in the report, it's one of the words that appears the most, and I'll come back to that one in a minute. Independence and motivation, and again, this links back to the modelling, because there was a lot in there about teacher modelling and that being a way of developing pupils' independence. I think that's actually a particularly interesting point at the moment, where we could have a situation where some pupils are learning remotely and haven't got the teacher there to ask for help all the time necessarily. So trying to develop those metacognitive skills and their independence to tackle something without you there helping them, and be that through multiple sort of annotated worked examples or video examples or various other things that we could go down the route of there. Tasks and resources. What we found with tasks and resources is that the evidence review has found that the task you use is less important than sort of how you use it. Now, that's not to say that tasks aren't important, they absolutely are. But the thinking that goes around a task. So in other words, don't expect a task by itself to improve maths teaching. It's the thinking that goes around those tasks and resources that's really important. There was something in there about calculators actually at primary school, which got a few headlines when the report came out, but the review team found that actually primary schools should be using calculators. And I know that there isn't a SATs paper anymore where they have to use a calculator, but that's not a good enough reason to not use them. And actually, especially in problem solving, they found that calculators could be really beneficial, because they allowed the child to focus on the problem rather than the sort of mechanics of doing some of the calculations involved in that problem. Obviously, they need to be able to do those calculations on pen and paper, but it detracted from the problem solving. So the review team suggested that there is a definite place for calculators in the primary classroom. And then we come on to interventions. Now, interventions is far down the list for a reason, because actually, as I said before, it shouldn't be the first place that we're focusing. We should be looking at the classroom teaching first, but there will be a point where we need interventions, and there's some information in there about how to best do that. And then transition. Now this was an odd one, because we didn't find a huge amount of evidence for how to really make transition effective, but we did find evidence that transition was really important. There's a few things in there in the report, but there's that's an area where I think there's definitely some further sort of exploration to do about how we bridge that transition. And the same goes actually for early years into Key Stage 1, because the evidence around that transition point is pretty weak as well. So I just want to share a few sort of key messages that I think are useful at the moment. I've mentioned the first one twice already. I make no apologies for keep coming back to that, because it is, the message I would urge everyone to take away this year. Great teaching is the most important thing that we can do to help our young people. I think we have to be careful this year, because all of these new habits and routines and approaches, I'm in school a couple of days a week. A lot of the talk is around logistics and one-way systems and bubbles and hand washing and so on. And that's going to happen at the moment. And we need to be careful when we're talking to schools at the moment about, where they're focusing their attention. Meaningful and manageable assessment is key. Park that, I'll be back on that in 1 minute. New challenges might mean that existing evidence is a helpful and important steer. And I think this is really useful. And I'm really glad to put this webinar on today, because it's coming back to a 3-year-old report. But I think some of the messages in there are really timely, because, there's almost been a bit of a reset button pressed. And actually, let's just revisit this evidence, and let's just remember where we're going here and where we need to be at. And implementation is a challenge at the best of times, but at the moment is particularly a challenge. So a lot of people asked about assessment, and this is some of the points that I've taken from the report about assessment. The thing that we found about assessment is that it's not just about tracking learning. There is an element of that in assessment. We will always need to keep some kind of a track on what children are learning. But the main purpose of assessment is about providing this information about what pupils do and don't know, and then using that to plan future lessons. We found that it was quite possible for strengths to be in one area of maths and weaknesses in another, and that's quite often overlooked. And we found formal tests can be useful, but actually low stakes quizzes, diagnostic questions, things like LBQ that Pat will share with you later on, little observations of pupils, discussion, that's where a lot of the real useful assessment actually takes place. And we did find some evidence about fluent recall of number facts being important, because that underpins some of the stuff that comes later. So things like times tables, we did find that's important because, you know, when you come onto harder maths, so to speak, if you're struggling with what 6 8s are, you're losing track of that, you know, problem that you're trying to solve. Professor Rob Coe wrote a really great blog for the EEF website, and it's a 2-part blog, and it was came out in June. I'd urge you to read this because he talks about some of these things that schools do that perhaps they would be better off doing something different. I just skipped a slide down. I'm going to go back to it, and some of these myths have come out in this slide here. So this idea that we just should gather data for the sake of data isn't supported by evidence, and actually a lot of assessment data is pretty useless in terms of what we actually do next to teach kids maths. So being really mindful of what you're collecting and why you're collecting it. So it might be tempting to do a big baseline test at the moment to find out sort of what learning has been lost, so to speak, during the closures. Actually, there might be better things that we can do. Multiple choice questions get a bit of a hard time, but actually there's pretty good evidence that they are a useful form of assessment, especially, in fact, only when the wrong answers have been cleverly designed so that they are based upon common misconceptions. What they can do then is really pick out exactly what misconception a child has, what issue a child has, and can really help you decide what to do next. Past exam questions can't always do that, and one of the issues with exam questions is that they are not designed to be diagnostic. A lot of secondary schools, unfortunately, use GCSE papers way too early. I've even heard of it being done in year 7, and it isn't really helpful because it doesn't help you to decide what to do next. That's not how those questions are designed. They're a purely summative assessment. They're the only real form of purely summative assessment. So actually, rather than using past exam questions and sort of big formal tests at the moment, the evidence would steer us towards little diagnostic quizzes in school, in lessons, things like retrieval practice, not things that need a lot of marking, and that's the 5th myth on this sheet here, because it doesn't have to mean an increase in workload. It could be there's a technological solution like LBQ and others. It could be that there's things like Diagnostic Questions website that Craig Barton runs that is already done for you and doesn't necessarily need a lot of extra work. So we're not talking about here about a massive increase of marking. Assessment doesn't necessarily have to be marked, so it doesn't necessarily need a big increase in workload. I just wanted to touch on misconceptions as well, and I wrote a blog on the EEF website just a couple of weeks ago now, because I think there's been a lot of talk around assessments at the moment about misconceptions that might have formed or developed during partial school closures, and just a few things that we found again in the evidence that might be useful. So one of the things was about the way we talk in lessons, and one problem that we have is that pupils often develop their own misconceptions and then think that we told them that thing. So 2 minuses make a plus is the classic. I've never told a child that 2 minuses make a plus, but I hear kids I taught saying it, and it's because they have noticed patterns in things and they've put that together for themselves. Multiplication makes things bigger is another good one, and that's because they see multiplication making things bigger, and so they form that misconception for themselves. But actually being really clear that even when we're teaching something, and maybe later on it's going to get harder, and we know it's going to get harder, sharing that with the kids, saying actually some people think multiplication makes bigger, and you might think at the moment that that is true, but later on we'll work with some numbers and you'll notice that that isn't true. So, you know, actually laying that out on the table and sort of putting it out there that isn't right, rather than letting that form themselves. Also, there's a temptation sometimes to cut corners and to do something that later on is likely to cause an issue further down the line as the maths becomes more sophisticated. Trigonometry only works for right angled triangles. Well, hang on a minute. All of a sudden now we're doing the sine and cosine rule and these triangles aren't right angled anymore. So whilst it was convenient at the time to say that, but actually sharing that with pupils and making sure that they are aware of that. We found planning ahead and collaborating to be really useful. So teams of mathematics teachers or teachers in primary schools actually getting together and before the topic is taught, thinking about what are likely to be the misconceptions here, what might have formed during lockdown that we need to be aware of, and so on. And I've already mentioned multiple choice questions because they are something that I think that we can make really good use of. I just wanted to signpost something that's going to come out soon off the back of the report, actually, and this is just a draft on here, so that's why it's not complete. We're going to start after Christmas releasing some sort of teaching notes, and it's going to be called Integrating Evidence into Maths Teaching, where every month we will share a particular aspect that came out strongly in the report. So this one here is on assessment. Some myths around that, some key things from the report, some little vignettes which are just sort of made up little situations where with some discussion points attached, so good for use in like department meetings and things like that, and also some case studies, so working with schools on how have you put this evidence into action in your school and sharing that, and hopefully those will be really useful, and those are going to start coming out in January. Again, it'll be all over the EEF's Twitter but also the website as well. When those do come out. Okay, I don't know if there are any further questions. I did save a little bit of time at the end in case there were. My research school email address is on the screen at the moment. Please, if you do need to or want to get in touch with anything, so it could be something that I've mentioned, or it could even be contributing to one of those case studies I just talked about. If that's something that, you know, if you think actually, you know, we do that thing really well and I'd like to share that, please get in touch, and it might be that we can work on that. And my Twitter handle there, again, I spend far too much time on there, but if you want to join me, then that's there as well. Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us this evening. Hope that's been useful. Sorry,
Simon, I've got one question that I can't answer. You might be able to answer from Alex, who's asked, is there a database of misconceptions somewhere, collecting together the common misconceptions by topic?
That's really interesting, and if there is, I'm not aware of it. And I think certainly I have got a book, which is I'm looking at a bookshelf, so that's why I'm looking down there. There's a primary one. Let me just grab it. Children's Errors in Mathematics. There it is, by Alice Hanson. But it is very much primary, and I'm not aware of a collection that's been done for older children into secondary. I do think though that will be a very useful addition. So if you're offering to write one, then yeah, I'll buy one.
Tom has put in the Q&A. I don't know if everyone can see the Q&As. He said, read misconceptions, use diagnostic questions, and look at the answers that pupils give. This will help. And
yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's so much to be said for, and this point around assessment. I think when we say assessment in schools, we think of testing, and parents think of testing, and I think that's such a mistake. And I think there's so much to be said for diagnostic questions, and obviously carefully used, you can really get to the heart of exactly what problem a child has with something, which you can't always do in a written test. You know, a 4-mark question on a written test, and you know all the kids get 2 marks each, but it's a different 2 marks, and you think, well, where the heck do I go with that? When actually, if you can really pinpoint, actually this group of children have got this issue with exactly that problem, that it can be so much more beneficial as a teacher to have that level of that granular detail.
It is something that, I mean, I know we at LBQ sort of highlight misconceptions with our questions sets. And Catherine has said there's some good ones on Kangaroo Math site. In each scheme of work, there are common misconceptions. And a kiss at the end.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that one. Yeah, that's a great website, Kangaroo Maths. A scheme of work has misconceptions embedded into it. Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. I've just seen someone asking for Rob Coe's blog. It's actually on the EEF website rather than evidence-based education. So,
oh, is it? I did a quick Google search. I wasn't sure if
no, it's okay. He does work for evidence-based education, but if you Google EEF blog Rob Coe assessment, something like that, you will find it.
Let's have a look. Well spotted.
I think we put it in the chat.
Oh, great. Is it there?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the right one.
Is that the right one? Excellent. Good. Is there any other questions before we come to a close? Oh, here we are. We've got one from Ruth. Do you have a view on the national tutoring programme? We're trying to decide whether it's worthwhile or if we're better off potentially paying staff in school to run some intervention in numeracy and literacy.
Yeah, I think it depends on the individual school, to be honest. It's a really difficult question to just say, yes, you should do it or no, you shouldn't. Now, I'll put my cards on the table. EEF are leading one strand of the NTP, but I'm not biased. So I would say I will say that the process that's being gone through in order to select the tutoring organisations is a rigorous one. About 400 tutoring organisations have applied for that and are being whittled down quite a lot before the sort of list of approved ones is released. They will be organisations that have experience of working in schools in disadvantaged communities, and they will have to meet certain criteria which are based on the evidence around effective tutoring. So they will have to demonstrate that their tutoring will work with classroom teaching rather than be separate from classroom teaching, because one of the big things about tutoring and also things about sort of when the tutoring takes place, not always missing the same lesson, and there's various different things that they will have to do in order to meet that. So all I would say is I know NTP are doing a webinar soon, next week I think. If you go on NTP's Twitter feed, there's a link to it. So I think it's down to individual schools to decide that, but certainly as far as we're concerned, there is a strong evidence base that tutoring can be effective if it's done under the right circumstances. What I would say is it's worth exploring.
Okay, lovely. And then I've got one last question, I think, from Deb, asking how do you see EEF guidelines linking with teaching for mastery, i.e. in the NCETM?
Yeah, I don't think it goes against it, is what I would say. And this was one of the very first questions actually that I was asked straight after the report came out. We did a launch event in Blackpool with Pete Henderson, one of the authors from EEF, and at the end someone stayed behind and asked that exact question. We deliberately do not promote any particular scheme or anything like that. That's not EEF's way. We present the evidence around effective maths teaching, and I think a lot of what is in the guidance report is also evident in the Maths Hub's sort of mastery approaches. I'm not going to say that they align perfectly because I don't think they do 100%, and there's probably elements of that if we were strictly evidence informed and evidence based, we might change a little bit. But what I would say is that I don't see that there's a clash between the EEF guidance. It's not one or the other. I think you can very easily be true to what the evidence says whilst going along with the sort of Maths Hub's approach to mastery. Would be my answer to that.
That's lovely. I think there's no more questions coming in. This is your last chance, I think. What we're going to do, Pat's going to do a really quick demo of LBQ. I mean, Pat, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank Simon very much for his words about the report, and we hope it's answered a lot of questions. We did realise there was an awful lot of questions. I don't think we had expected to get as many people turn up as we did, which is great that you can spare your time after school, after work to carry on. Yeah, we work for Learning by Questions. You might have heard of us. Dial's raised his hand. I'm not quite sure what he wants to do. If you've got a question, put it in chat. Lots of thank yous. If you want to stay for a very 5-minute quick demo, that's great. Love it if you could. If I can just share my screen now, Simon, and then let's get the show going. So can you see my screen, Helen?
Yes.
Sorry, Jill. So
No,
learning by questions, what are we? We're an online teaching and learning resource for both teachers to have questions to teach with and for children to be able to answer questions. We're a cloud-based solution. So if you've got any internet-enabled device, it's going to work. This is our website. We've got a catch-up slot where you can book a demo if you want your own personal demo to the school for both primary and secondary. Top right-hand side, it says try LBQ. You can sign up here for a free 60-day account.
Pat, the screen's not sharing, Pat.
Is it not?
No, sorry. I was looking at the questions. Someone just alerted me at the questions. Ruth, thank you.
So, oh dear.
We'll see it.
Just 1 second. I seem to have lost my actual screen. No, that's not it.
Do you want me to share mine and talk you?
Yeah, do you want to just share yours and
See if I can do mine.
Apologies, I seem to have lost everybody off my computer. So learning by questions, we offer. Yeah, that's it, Jill. You've got it straight away.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So where do you talk and I'll go?
Yeah, so you can sign up for a free 60-day account. We've got complete coverage of Key Stage 2 for maths, English and science. Obviously, you're all maths teachers, but we've got the same for science and English. We've got Key Stage 3 for maths and science, and we're starting to do an awful lot of Key Stage 4. Best thing to do is just to show you a question set. So if Jill just logs in,
yeah,
that's fantastic. Yeah, and across the top we've got subjects. We'll click on maths, and you can see we've got our topics down left-hand side. Talking about what the EEF report said, one of the best things to do is to build on prior knowledge. What do I know pupils have missed? I'm teaching, say, addition and subtraction. Across the top, I've got my filters. I'm in year 5. So probably the best thing to do is choose year 4 and 5 content. And I want to do a topic review. There we are, add and subtract topic review. So a very quick, low stakes quiz to assess where those gaps might have been. It's not a big test, won't take long, take about 10, 15 minutes to run with the children. Covers all the areas of adding and subtracting. I'm here now with it. What can I do with it? I like it. I can start it straight away. I can put it on the calendar. So if I start it, defaults for an hour, set my class off running, and that will generate a unique 3-digit code. That 3-digit code I can share on Seesaw or on Google Classrooms or whatever it is I want to do. If Jill just pulls the code back up again.
All right, there you go. I got click happy, you know me.
Okay.
That's the code.
So there's a code. And at the bottom, you'll see it says lbq.org/task. If you click on that, Jill, that'll open up another window. And that URL at the top left-hand side with a pin already in it, that's what you can copy and paste into your management system that you're using with your children. So like I say, Seesaw, Google Classroom, whatever it is, and they'll just click on that link and they can then go straight in. If you can copy that into chat, into the Q&A, Jill, or into chat.
Yeah.
And then if you can have a go, you'll get a chance to experience what it's like as a pupil. So if you just copy that URL there, yeah, the whole thing.
I'll go back here.
I think it's the best to start, Jill.
No, I can't go back into my Q&A, I'm afraid.
And okay, if Jill just starts answering questions, and I'll answer questions as well, because I've got the app on my phone.
You answer them, I'll put up the teacher's view. Oh, it's all, there we go.
There we are. So Jill starts to answer questions, I'll start to answer questions as well, and then you'll very quickly get to see what it's like for a student. So how can you log in? If you go to www.lbq.org/task, and then once you get there, put in the code, and the code is OPI. And if you can make a mistake as if you were a child making a mistake, because this is what we're trying to do, we're trying to find out where those mistakes are, where those gaps in the curriculum are. And so if you get them wrong deliberately, you'll then get to see the difference that feedback can make. So all our questions come with feedback. That feedback is for both correct and incorrect answers. And it's not just to say you're wrong or try again. It actually gives guidance for you to get the correct answer. So it's kind of like having the teacher stood on your shoulder And as you can see, Jill's going through. We've got pictorial representation. Some of them give you the strategies that you could use for helping to solve that particular question, which again is what the EEF report alluded to. It develops independence. The children are working on their own. It builds in that extra resilience. So if they are getting something wrong, they're not finding out it's wrong the next day or 2 days later when the teachers hand the books back. And that's really, really key and important. It's about this intervening when a mistake's made rather than letting the children carry on again and again and again. The resources have been written by maths experts, so they're designed to challenge. And you can see the question set that Jill's showing you now at the moment, we're in the understanding part. So regardless of whether you believe in Singapore, Shanghai, which version of maths mastery, it doesn't really matter. All mastery says that children have to be fluent, be able to reason, solve problems, have confidence, can go into great details. They can use mathematical language to explain. And we could do a whole webinar on, and I'm sure Simon would agree, on the use of the correct mathematical language. You know, in science, we talk about opaque and transparent and translucent. We don't say it's a little bit light through or a lot light through. But in maths, we seem to shy away, especially at primary, from discussing things like operands and the correct mathematical terms for different parts of numbers. So whilst the teachers, sorry, Joe, where have you gone?
Sorry, I'm here. I was just going back to learning my questions. Do you want the matrix?
No, we've got the result matrix up now. So teachers are busy and are busy kind of supporting children in the classroom. It's online. So this means I can walk around the classroom with a tablet in my hand, pre-COVID days, and actually go over to a child. Nowadays, I can probably stand at the front of the class and monitor what's going on in real time. And this is the real beauty. You can see who needs help. So at the moment, the names are anonymized, but we can click on that and show that Jill, yeah, she's a bit struggling, is Jill. She's not having a good day. It's probably something's happened at home, perhaps. Alex, well, he's being challenged and he's moving through quite well. But Pat has had 2 goes at question number 1 and he hasn't got much further. Can you just click the 4 square? That's the one. Make it a bit bigger. That's clearer. Green squares, they're small. Why are they small? Well, it's because the answer's correct. And as a teacher, as Simon said, we learn more from what the children don't know than what they do know. And this is where LBQ helps support that. Straight away, I can see question 1, I told you to get it all wrong. That was the one you got wrong. But you can imagine question 4 seems to be a bit tricky too. And I can click on question 4. I can bring it up, put it on my smart board at the front of class, and I can start to delve into it. I can pause the whole class. So if Jill pauses the class, so now your tablet can't be used. We can annotate this. So it says round 12,000, so the nearest 1,000. So that's probably going to be 12,000. And we can put that in to give a bit of extra support. 11, yeah, that might be enough support now. Now if I press play, I can send that out to all the children. So now if you look at your window, which you've got open at LBQ, you'll see that, yes, there's that supporting extra help that we've given. So the children can then start to answer with that targeted support that you've done on a question. So the idea, again, is it goes back to this, gives children something they can do, something they can't do, intervene where you need to. And you can see all the answers that are being brought up. So that's how you can do an intervention. And it's in the classroom, it's not outside, it's not extra, it's at the point of misunderstanding. Back to our result matrix, Alex hasn't answered questions 8, 9, or 10, but he seems to have jumped to 11. That's because we think that after about 70% of understanding, you need to be moved on into something a bit more challenging. And that's the same for both fluency, again, a 70% pass rate, but then we want you to answer all the reasoning questions and all the solving problems at greater depth. We do have 1-step word problems in fluency, but the real challenging, that might pull different strands together. So it might pull fractions and perimeter and money together. So the children really have to think about, what is it I'm trying to do here? It's not just, oh, add those 2 numbers together, add that amount to that amount to get the total. So it goes back to what Simon was saying about the problem with problem solving is to make those problems not something which is just, oh, use this method and you'll get the right answer. As you've probably seen, all the questions have got pictorial support, and that level of pictorial support slowly starts to be removed. Jay is absolutely flying through there. That's fine.
Sorry. I was going to show you pictorial support. I'll go back.
So Jay's absolutely flying. And that's great, but pupil 3 is really, really struggling. So this is probably too hard for pupil 3. They may have had time off. They may just be having a really bad day. It might be a child new to the school and you don't know what their capabilities are. But with LBQ, you've got the ability to add a second task and a third task. And it's as easy as pressing add task, back into maths. And it might be that they're working on number 1s to 10 or number 1s to 20 from Key Stage 1. So we've got something that is suitable for every single child. So you just click on addition and subtraction, click on year 1, 2.
I can do
year 1 and 2 at the top, Jill.
Yeah.
And then if you go to number on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Counting multiples of 2, 4, 8. Something that's probably better for them to be learning to do, or a skill to keep practicing. And then just start that one. And then if Jill goes back to the other window.
Oh, this is.
And then goes back. Yeah. And you can see now we've got 2 tasks running. And for those people who say, oh, GCSEs, as Simon was saying, we don't want to just keep giving them previous test papers, because that's not the purpose of those test papers. We've got GCSE questions available too. So if Jill goes back to our resources.
Sorry, I got lost in the maths.
That's okay. If you go back to all our resources that we have for maths, go back to my LBQ. And if you do sign up for a trial or you do go and purchase, you have both primary and secondary content available, because we do know there's teachers in year 7 and 8 who are still, unfortunately, teaching children working at year 5 and 6 in primary school. So if you just click on secondary maths, Jill, and then choose year 10, 11, and then choose algebra if you want, or want any one of them, you'll see we've got content suitable, and we've got GCSE style questions as well, should you want to actually practice them. So trying to basically say we've got content for just about everybody. We should finish the Key Stage 4 offering, I think, early end of this year, sometime next year. We'll have complete coverage, but we have most topics covered. And then the last button to show you before we go is the dashboard. So as we were saying, we're trying to save you time with our marking. And here's not just the marking done, but the data analysis done. So it shows question 1 was the most challenging question because we told you to get them wrong. But it could be that this is question 6 or 7 or 14. And this could be your mini plenary where you pause the whole class, or it might be the teaching point for tomorrow. So the idea is you're using this, obviously not trying to tell teachers how to teach here, because I used to be a teacher too, but it's enabling you to have that time after the lesson in the evening to plan the next lesson with quality without having to do all your marking, because it's been done for you and your assessment's been done for you. So that's kind of a brief snapshot of LBQ. It does a lot more than just that, but I'm conscious that we said this webinar would be an hour and an hour's up. If you've got any questions about LBQ, please do fire them in. Can't see Pat's screen. Okay, thanks. Webinars useful.
I'm back.
People, any plans for non-IT resources? Okay, custom colouring. That might be for you as well, I think, Simon. Love LBQ. Everyone should use it. It's a fab tool. Thanks, Louis. Thank you for it. It's very informative. Can't see the screen. So if you do want if you want to sign up for a free account, you can. And if you want a demo, you can go to LBQ and book your demo.